Good evening, good morning. Welcome to week 6 for PSSL 6240, George Washington University. I just want to start off with a couple of announcements and then do the typical review of last week, preview of next week. So, just the first announcement, Adobe Connect session. We had, I think, a pretty good one in week 2. We'll have another one in week 7. So, Thursday on June 12th, 2014, we will have our second Adobe Connect session, and we'll talk about two things. First, we'll go over a quick review of the exam, or what's going to be on the exam and what the expectations are for the final exam. We'll talk the last paper for a couple of minutes and talk about that in detail. And then what I want to spend about half of the session is talk about careers. Careers in the federal government, careers in the defense community, careers in the intelligence community, careers even at the state, local law enforcement, or even in the private sector as well. So be prepared to have your questions at that time and be prepared to share your insights for that period. So that's the first announcement. The second announcement is discussion boards. I want to echo what Greg said about the discussion boards. Do not just give me a summary of the readings on the discussion boards. The whole point is to ask those pointed questions so you can fuse both what you saw in the readings, what you heard in the lectures, and what you read in the readings, and most importantly, your personal insights and personal analysis as well. So I want to kind of see all those points brought up in the discussion section in a good, concise product. All right, so it shouldn't just be a review. It shouldn't just be a review. It should be your own analysis for each discussion section. So with that being covered, just covered in the review of last week. Actually, before we do that, kind of some current events. For those of you who didn't see or didn't hear, President Obama talked at West Point, and probably the most intriguing thing he brought up was this $5 billion fund. Pardon me for that. Was this $5 billion fund for overseas contingency operations, for trying to prevent terrorism at its source. And this would allow for most likely security assistance missions, special operations, leadership targeting, as well as economic development projects. And I think, again, I'm going to give my own opinions here. I think that is a step in the right direction. It certainly reflects what the American people, don't want. They don't want to do any more Iraqs or Afghanistans where we're committing hundreds of thousands of troops and hundreds of billions of dollars to fight terrorism. I think the more surgical way, the more cost-effective way is security assistance missions to governments, to these countries that face a terrorism threat. The problem is, who do you fund? So if we want to, let's say, go after Boko Haram after all those girls were kidnapped in Nigeria, and we give $1 billion to the government of Nigeria to fight terrorism, do we really think that $1 billion is going to go to actually fight terrorism? Between the corruption and maybe even the apathy of the government of Nigeria, it'd be hard to think that there will be actually capabilities that flow out of that. So that's probably the biggest challenge that we would see in this. But if you have a host nation government, and I brought up the example of the Philippines in the lecture, where the government is generally less corrupt and generally wants to fight terrorism, then yes, this $5 billion fund is going to be a very, very useful tool in that toolbox. So, with that being said, just cover some of the key points. Israel counterterrorism strategy. Professor Gore and I talked about that in the lecture. I think the lessons learned are key here. Their use of tactical intelligence, their use of resiliency, what they do that the United States doesn't do. That's going to be a key component for here going forward. Another point that Professor Gore brought up was demolitions don't work, and they stopped doing that when you would tear down the house or the neighbor of a suicide bomber as a deterrent. When they realized it didn't work, they stopped doing that. I'm actually surprised or I shouldn't be surprised. In the United States, I can tell you that we spend billions of dollars on things that don't work a lot of the time in this field. So lessons learned from Israel, and then the U.S. counterterrorism perspective. I'll give you the Van Ever article I assigned, but I don't like the article. I think it's very poorly written. I think it's very pedantic. I think it's just a laundry list of things that go wrong. That's not writing. Anyone could write a laundry list of things that go wrong. So I assign it, and I was hoping some people did, some people didn't, were to get some critiques on that. I was also, I mentioned in the lecture, and I didn't see much on the discussion points, was the Zakaria article, and asked the question, are we winning the global war on terror? Are we at a tipping point for Islamic terrorism that we're facing? You hear on the news, Islamic terrorism is on the march. Islamic radicalism is on the march. Is that true? Is that just a guy saying that on the news so he can get himself on the news? I would ask to really think about that question. Is Islamic fundamentalism, is Islamic radicalism on the march? Zakaria says no. I tend to agree with him on that facet as well. And I'll just leave it at that, and I'll just be curious what kind of your opinions are on that matter. And then next week, so preview that covers kind of last week. You will have a choice of doing a paper on counterterrorism strategy, and it's very likely you'll see questions on counterterrorism strategy on your final. So going on to week 6, intelligence and counterterrorism. This focus is more on 9/11 and the post 9/11 intelligence failures. There are 3 documentaries for you to look at. These documentaries are actually really good. They're entertaining. My wife, who's a nurse, she's not in this field, but she watched them with me, and she thought they were excellent documentaries, well put together. And I think that unlike previous documentaries, this is definitely family friendly. So if you want to spend a Wednesday night watching these, that's perfectly it'll be amenable to your families. We'll say that. The first documentary is the National Geographic 9/11 documentary. What I want you to do is when you're looking at that is look for those points, these intelligence failures, or where you think the intelligence community, local law enforcement should have been able to interdict the 9/11 plots. And I talk about it in the lectures, but there are several missed opportunities here that could have stopped 9/11. And then the question I ask is, after spending billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, depending how you calculate it, why do we still have these intelligence failures? Why are we still unable to connect the dots? So those are the questions you have. But you'll see in the National Geographic documentary, you'll see it in the NOVA documentary on the NSA. That was not covered in the 9/11 Commission. 9/11 Commission did not mention NSA, and there was a significant intelligence failure there. And the NOVA documentary goes in pretty good detail on that. And then the final documentary is the BBC documentary on the underwear bomber, or the Christmas Day bomber, for those of you who remember back on Christmas Day in 2009. And then it talks again about the bomb, how it was made, and most importantly, the intelligence watch listing failures surrounding that incident. So all 3 are excellent documentaries, and I highly recommend them to keep them in your collection. You'll also be looking at a reading on the Fort Hood shooting. It's a pretty good detail, as well as the 9/11 Commission chapter that I assigned. So when you're looking at this for this week, there's 2 questions I ask, and then I want you to have in the back of your head. First, what are the 9/11 intelligence failures, and is 9/11 an intelligence failure? Like I said earlier, where could it have been stopped? What were the gates that the intelligence or the 9/11 plot could have been stopped? So that's question 1. And then question 2, again, why, despite spending billions, hundreds of billions on homeland security, intelligence reform, watch listing, you massive federal and government and federal employees, why do we still have these failures? Why do we still have Bostons and Fort Hood shootings and underwear bombings? And are we really safe? So those are kind of the two questions to ask. I look forward to your points in the discussion board. And if there's any questions or issues, please let me know.